everybody. Welcome to Psychedelics Today with your host, David Drapkin. Today, having a chat with Kevin Balktick, the founder of Horizons PBC and the world-famous conferences around the subjects of psychedelic studies. So we chatted very recently about the Horizons bus parking itself in Portland, Oregon, in a month's time. So fantastic to hear the origin story of Horizons New York. This is going to be their 15th year of doing the work and kind of where that vision came from. And it was starting because there just simply wasn't a place to talk openly, for people to meet, to kind of come out the shadows, to discuss the research, the science, the trials, and just the real life experiences of using psychedelics and helping people to kind of use them safely. So that's kind of where it came from, in that church basement 15 years ago. And now it's moving to a beautiful art gallery in Portland, Oregon, for a similar reason, because there's amazing things happening in Oregon. And Kevin's saying that that's a place where it needs to be right now. And we're going to help to kind of germinate the power, the essence that is coming down the pipeline in Portland because of the Psilocybin Act. And it's complicated stuff. So this is going to be an opportunity for people to kind of group together from different levels of the ecosystem to talk about how do we work together on this complicated project, and how do we make sure that local people that might not be those with big VC money attached, but they can be part of this unfolding, this kind of ecosystem that's going to be very unique in Oregon, grassroots up. So the conference itself is now 4 days. So that's a change I want to make sure you're all aware of. It starts Thursday, the 15th of September. And that day is all about the Oregon psilocybin economy. And then there's 3 more days of general conference, Friday, 16th, Saturday, 17th, Sunday, the 18th of September. If you'd like to get a ticket using our code to get you 17% off, then use this code, Psychedelics Today NW-17. And Kevin says in our chat that they also have a huge passion to help people that still can't afford to come. It's hard to get there with scholarships. So definitely click on that scholarships option on the registration page, and look out for a flummoxing piece of trivia that Kevin said around Anne and Sasha Shulgin being married by a DEA officer. I was totally hit left side by that one. All right, so here's his bio. Kevin Balktick is the founder and director of Horizons, one of the world's longest running psychedelic media education and community institutions. He convened the first Horizons conference in 2007 in New York City out of a desire to change the public narrative around psychedelics and strengthen its community, and has guided the organization's growth over the last 14 years. In addition to his work in Horizons, Kevin has been a prolific producer and creative director of arts and culture projects in NYC. His work has been featured in the New York Times, National Public Radio, The New Yorker, The Washington Post Magazine, Vogue, WWD, Vice, Hospitality Design, NHT in Japan, The Guardian UK, Haaretz in Israel, and other publications. Enjoy this show, everyone. Oh, and by the way, Joe, Kyle, Christina, and John are all going to be at the conference from Psychedelics Today. So say hello from me. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today with your host, David Drapkin, speaking today with Kevin Balktick of Horizons. Good to see you, Kevin. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me out, David.
Yeah, you're welcome. Lovely to see you, Kevin. So we're pretty close to each other in the world, but not in the universe when you zoom out that far. But I'm over in Teaneck, New Jersey. Whereabouts are you today?
Well, I'm typically located in New York City, but for the summer, I've decamped to the Hudson Valley, which is, I'm sitting in a river town just about 90 miles north of New York City.
Beautiful. Yeah, there's quite a scene up there, isn't there? The Hudson Valley, lots of artists and psychedelic folks. It's do you have a scene or a little community you belong to? Is it more kind of solo style for the summer?
Well, we're certainly never bored up here, and there is quite a bit of psychedelic community both year round, but in particular in the summer up here. But you also have the bicycling, kayaking, little hikes, and more people doing things outdoors.
Yeah. So I think a good place to start, Kevin, is around you personally. So feel free to be as creative with your liberties as you wish in expressing about who you are, minimalist or expansiveness. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I've only really started talking about myself recently. My inclination has always been to be kind of, behind the scenes and doing work in service of putting others in on stage and on behind the podiums. And the other sort of Horizons committee members and other people have encouraged me to share more personally about myself more recently. So I've started doing so both at the conference, but also with journalists and others in these kinds of settings. So when I was in my late teens and earliest 20s, which is no longer feeling like it was quite so recently, I had a series of experiences with psychedelics that were very powerful and meaningful. And I just could not believe how obscure they were, that not everyone was amazed and fascinated by these drugs and these experiences. And I set out trying to learn everything I could, and reading the then many decades of literature in the English language, and connecting with other people who also shared this interest. And at that time, and this is in the end of the 90s and the earliest 2000s, the community was much smaller and it was also more closed, where it was not as it is today, where there are so many psychedelic community events that no one should even want to go to all of them. They were few and far between, and they were often either had a new age orientation that did not resonate with me, or sometimes everything was private and there were salons and you had to know people to become invited. There was very pervasive fear about law enforcement, where people thought simply by being publicly associated with psychedelics in any way that they could become a target for investigation, even to the point where people were concerned that by even attending an event that was about psychedelics, buying tickets on a credit card, things like that, that they might become the object of scrutiny. So I really was in this period, which I guess has not stopped, of just deep fascination and engagement, not only with the psychedelic experiences, but also just wanting to learn about them and connect with other people who also wanted to do so. But at that time, it was very, very challenging, especially as a new young person in the field who didn't already know everyone and didn't necessarily have the secret handshakes and passwords at the ready. So in what I believe was January of 2006, there was a tremendous event in Basel, Switzerland on the occasion of Albert Hoffman's 100th birthday that I learned about. And after, burying myself in kind of the old paperbacks and Erowid and all of the sources I could find to learn about psychedelics, I found my way to Basel. I believe I stayed in the Hosteling International Youth Hostel there, and I really couldn't believe it that there were thousands of people there who had this deep interest and commitment with psychedelics, that wanted to discuss it in an intellectual level. All of the scholars and folk heroes and researchers and activists that I'd been reading about, were there in person, and you could go and talk to them and hang out with them at the parties and make lots of connections. And I just thought that was so wonderful and inspiring. And I had such a feeling of optimism coming out of it. Finally, there are other people who I can talk to who take this seriously and want to engage with it and really believe in the potential of psychedelics, and that I don't have to be, in the chill out room at a rave or in other, sites of questionable subculture knowledge. And I came back to the US and I just wanted to go to one of these things again. And there really wasn't a lot happening. And again, the things that were either very private. Some of them I felt that the quality of the knowledge was not necessarily so high in terms of accuracy, or some of the framing in terms of spiritual beliefs did not work for me. And I kind of set about creating horizons so that I didn't have to go to Switzerland every time I wanted to talk to other people who were well-read and deeply committed to the field of psychedelics. So for me, it's something I encountered, as a lot of people do, in my late teens and early 20s. And I found psychedelics kind of through the gateway of subculture. And like a lot of people do, I got a lot more than I bargained for. And kind of the insight and meaning I got out of those experiences really drove me just to want to be more a part of the community, to want to learn more and to meet more people.
Thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate knowing that. I wasn't aware. It was really coming out of a place of curiosity in some respects, and appreciating the community you experienced in Basel, in Switzerland, back in 2006.
Yeah, I owe a great debt to Dieter, who is of course no longer with us, and Lucius at Gaia Media Foundation in Switzerland, because if I hadn't experienced their event in Basel in 2006, I don't know that I would have, turned around and then by autumn of 2007 have been holding the first Horizons.
I'm going to share a thought with you, Kevin, and I think you'll appreciate it, because we often don't know what is possible until we either vision it inside internally, or we see it or feel it, experience it somewhere else, and then we can kind of recreate it. And I think we have such a tendency of just kind of replicating things and not evolving and transforming experiences, because we just do what we've always done. But I've noticed lately, particularly working in the psychedelics world and having experiences of using psychedelics, and how they just kind of, I'm reluctant to use the word paradigm, but I do, but it just kind of creates like a different level or way of experiencing what is and isn't possible. So once you experience something, it's like, oh, wow, that's different to what I've grown up with, or what I've seen before, or how I've done that in the past. And it might just be, oh, I'm processing my emotions differently, or I'm seeing anger in a different way, or I'm looking at the world and nature differently, or at conferences and community differently. Then we know, oh gosh, there's a lot more possible than what I had previously thought.
Well, in response to that, I would say that is, I think, one of the hallmarks of many people's psychedelic insights, that they're suddenly able to see or believe in possibilities that may have been hard to envision or hard to feel confidence in before. But, in the case of that kind of origin story and putting Horizons together, it almost just felt conventional in a certain way, and that it could have been. And I've heard, similar stories from activists and other kinds of non-psychedelic fields, and that part of it was maybe more than any special inspiration. I didn't have a vision where psychedelic plant teachers told me to start a conference. In a way, it seemed like a common sense thing to do. And also because I was young and just starting a career as an event producer, and no one had told me I couldn't do something, it seemed to me that there were other people out there who would feel the way I did, who were deeply interested in psychedelics and very much wished that they could go to something once a year where they could meet other people and learn and connect. And that I also felt that the concern around law enforcement was to a large extent overstated, and that you could probably do a good event that was focused on scholarly quality knowledge in a respectable venue, and that the most likely thing was that nothing bad would happen from a law enforcement perspective. And because, I was young and in a process of my life where I was starting lots of things, I just kind of granted myself permission to do so. And I also didn't start it with a business plan. I didn't start it with a 5-year plan. It was not started with the goal of having a decade and a half in front of it. I simply wanted to do something once with the means I had, which were not very much, but to see if it would work. And I found a really lovely venue in Judson Memorial Church that was happy to host Horizons for whatever we could afford, which in the early years was almost nothing. I found in community members across the Northeast and from other places in the country, people who just very badly wanted to speak publicly on this topic and meet other people who wanted to listen and did not have expectations around compensation or first-class airfare or hotel rooms. We got a lot of strength from the community because there were so many people committed to this who also really felt it was a calling and an act of service and just this vital thing that needed to exist in the world. It's not as it is now, where people put together a slide deck and go out raising money, or maybe people who seek permission from others. This was a genuine community project that was really started on the time and energy I was quite honestly privileged to have, and others like myself that just really wanted to push this into existence.
Yeah.
And again, I reiterate that there was no mystical vision of having a conference. It seemed like an important practical thing that I could do that would be a contribution to the community. As I'm not a therapist, no one should want me to be their therapist. I'm not a scientist conducting experiments, but I did have a good sensibility for events and curatorial. And that was something that I could do that I felt like would be in service of this field. And we just went out and we started something.
What kind of events were you doing kind of before and as well as after Horizons? What kind of style did you imbue on those events and music and the kind of feel of them, just to paint a little picture?
Well, this was, of course, this was something I started. Horizons is my longest running project of any kind. And it was started when I was quite young. So I can't say that there was a lot of prior art, but I had been involved in working with community of art events, arts, entertainment, nightlife that was bubbling around New York City, and particularly in Brooklyn. I had been involved in the Burning Man community, which seems to always lurk in the background of the psychedelic field, although the future might be quite different than the past in that regard in North America. And it felt to me that, putting together just a simple event where we would find a nice venue that felt like it was worthy of respect, which is what Judson Memorial Church was. I didn't want this to be in an art space. I didn't want it to feel like it was part of subculture. That if the worst thing that happened was that there was a problem with the PowerPoint presentation or a projector error, and those things certainly did happen in the early years, plenty, not to mention, infamously at the last conference, that it's probably something just a good group of people who are dedicated could put together. In the years that, followed, I had a pretty wide-ranging career as an event producer, primarily in live arts, entertainment, festivals, nightlife, places where I felt that people were being given a direct experience, often using communities and artistry in a service of taking people somewhere where they felt like, they could come to something, they could experience something meaningful that was quite different from their day-to-day kind of routine, and they could come out of it, enriched in some way.
Just want to ask a quick question. I haven't been to Meow Wolf, but I've seen pictures and I know there's one or two of them in America now. They look amazing experiences from that kind of aesthetic, experiential kind of encounter. So I'm wondering, do you ever dream about that, or have you had any experiences similar to that where you've got that kind of immersive experience? And particularly even just, we could talk about what some of the folks are doing in the psychedelics world around virtual reality as well, and how does that kind of tap into that immersive experiencing?
Well, at the very first year at Horizons, Judson Memorial Church, and it's since been converted to a proper black box theater that local theater companies work with, but had kind of this old gym in the basement below the sanctuary that we also used, and we had sort of a psychedelic arts exhibition where we had a lot of different kind of immersive projects as well as traditional two-dimensional artwork. We also had receptions at Horizons where there was performing artists, musicians, things like that. So we've done a little bit of that with the conference. One of the things I did find right away was that the producing of these immersive kind of art exhibitions and experiences were something that were unfortunately costing the conference money and not making the conference money. And that at that time, in that era, there were no apparent founders for such a thing. So I unfortunately wasn't able to continue offering such a large arts program alongside Horizons. But, of course, I remain very, very interested in experiential artwork, installation artwork, performance art. Meow Wolf I have been to, and it's pretty jaw-dropping in its kind of fractal level of detail. And I do believe that the Meow Wolf creative directors are speaking openly about psychedelics now, and not that I think it was ever such a secret, but I believe there is a connection there.
Yeah.
There also is a Meow Wolf site in Denver, Colorado, where the MAPS Psychedelic Science 2023 event will be. And I think it should be a pretty entertaining week for that venue with the circus in town.
Yeah, that's going to be one hell of a week. I'm looking forward to that one. And your Northwest conference in September, so that's going to be at the Portland Art Museum. Mm-hmm. What kind of space is that? Like right now, what are the exhibits and how are they going to kind of squeeze in a psychedelic conference for the best part of a week into that space? What's the plan?
Well, quite ably. The Portland Art Museum is, despite its very westerly location, it's actually one of the oldest art museums in America. The building itself was designed as a Masonic temple. And in that era of American history, the Masons were quite a wealthy and influential group of people. So the art museum has the building that I believe was initially the temple structure that functions as an event venue, an exhibition venue, which is separate from the permanent exhibition space. And the art museum has been really lovely and welcoming. They like the idea of this happening under their roof. The quality of the facilities are quite high and dignified. They've also been kind enough to allow anyone who has a conference badge will also be able to access the art galleries. I must admit, I don't know what the current show is there, but it's a very good institution, and it does lend, I think, the kind of credence and respectability that this topic deserves. And, there's also something nice about it being a little bit of a historic venue, in the same way that our New York venues are also traditionally sort of historic places from a similar age, usually late 19th or very early 20th century. So there is a nice continuity there between the Northwest venue and the New York venues.
Yeah, there's something really special about being in old buildings. Just the architecture of it, the design, they just don't make them like that anymore, building.
It's quite an elegant place. And I also just, emphasize that the Portland Art Museum is not a psychedelic art museum. It is primarily a contemporary art space that does world-class exhibitions. And we're just really honored to be there, and that they've been so kind and welcoming, and see it as being good for their museum and good for Portland. As we're still waiting on our invitation in New York from the Metropolitan Museum to have the conference there.
That'd be amazing. Yeah, so living in Jersey, I've taken the kids over to those museums, and Natural History Museum and MoMA, and gosh, it's just beautiful. I wanted to just mention that, that very first conference back in New York 15 years ago was in a church, and we kind of went to the basement, and this time you're in an art museum in Portland in 2022 in what was a Freemason space and now an art gallery. It's beautiful to have that. Not sure how to express it, but just that kind of creativity and open expansiveness as well, like art, creativity, spirituality, religion, kind of brotherhood and sisterhood. So I really kind of jive with that, which is kind of aligning with where you felt you needed to bring this meeting place of people.
Yeah, I do believe that part of the event format, kind of part of the medium, is that the venue is kind of part of the message that you can't necessarily escape. So the selection of venues and the messages they communicate are kind of a big part of the set and setting. Although it would, be a lot easier in many ways, I've just never desired to have Horizons be at a hotel with carpet and acoustic tile ceilings and so on and so forth. I've always wanted to be in somewhere that has history and has kind of its own kind of character and dignity, aside from our content there. So with the Art Museum in Portland, and of course the Cooper Union and the New York Academy of Medicine in Manhattan, we've been really fortunate, and I hope that those messages are well received by the audience and the kind of institutions we align ourselves with.
Yeah. One thing that I think is also important to notice is, this Horizons Northwest is the first time venturing outside of the 5 boroughs of New York. So I definitely want to explore this. Like, why the Northwest? Why Portland? Why Oregon? And when did that kind of light bulb kind of start to light up for you?
So Horizons really began, and to a very large extent remains, a purely kind of community endeavor. And it's sort of the nascent years of the psychedelic renaissance. It was kind of put together on, hope streams, prayers, and it was to a large extent, a mixed volunteer and kind of stipend project where it just felt that it was something that we were obligated to do. There certainly was no obvious source of funding for gatherings advocating the use of psychedelics, or gatherings advocating, the consideration of psychedelics. So the speakers, myself, the team, everyone was doing all this other work. And then once a year, we would kind of breathe Horizons into existence, just on the strength of that kind of community spirit. What began happening 5 or 6 years ago was the acceleration of interest in psychedelics in the public. The FDA's breakthrough designations that were given to both MDMA and psilocybin-assisted therapy were very significant events. The publication, of course, of Michael Pollan's first the New Yorker article, and then a few years later, the book, were very significant events. And as the research at MAPS and Johns Hopkins and NYU and Imperial College continued to produce results that were very favorable, and as the regulatory agencies continued to accept those studies, and again, even in the case of granting a special designation to accelerate that research, all of a sudden, more donors arrived to fund this work. An entire industry kind of started taking shape around it. So there was a transition period where what had been kind of a once-a-year seasonal community project, while myself and other members of the team supported ourselves doing work on other projects outside the field of psychedelics, it suddenly became that, there was a lot more happening, and it required more effort to cover responsibly at the conference. When there were only a few studies happening and there weren't so many advocacy organizations or efforts, it was quite easy to curate. And that changed very, very dramatically over the span of time we've been doing this. And then alongside that, the potential, for all of us to have our little dream that we could spend our lives really working in service of the field of psychedelics, that went from being something that was seeming like it was going to be off in the future to becoming something that was, quite possible maybe in the near future. So there had never really been a thought about expanding Horizons very much for most of its existence, quite simply because it was a smaller field. There was very limited funding opportunities available, and myself and the rest of the team were quite busy with other things as well. And we looked at Horizons very much as a gift that once a year we wanted to give to the world and the community. So around the time Michael Pollan's book came out, we moved to larger and larger venues. Those venues began to sell out. The responsibility of producing the conference seemed to grow larger and larger. By the end of the 2019 conference, it was quite apparent that it was going to be possible for Horizons to grow. And what happened next, of course, was that COVID swept into the world and kind of upended the table for everyone whose life revolved around putting humans together in 3 dimensions. So we had kind of a desire to expand the event, first in New York by adding the CE, CME classes. And then there was always an inkling that could we do one of these somewhere else? It didn't feel urgent to do so. And also, I have to say that there were so many other people who were also doing very good community events throughout the country. And we never had the desire to be the big New York event showing up in other people's communities and presuming that we knew best what was for those geographies. So going into 2020, we had some ideas about primarily expanding our operations in New York. Perhaps we were going to do more standalone CE, CME events for professional audiences, or we were going to have smaller forums devoted to specific topics because we could no longer cover every topic in the depth that we wanted to on stage at the main event. And then, yes, like perhaps there were other places where we could kind of take the Horizons concept and format, and they could also succeed geographically. But it was quite honestly very, very hard in 2020 and 2021 just to sort of make it out alive and keep our heads above water. So alongside this, the measure in Oregon, which we had been aware of, passed and became kind of a done, a fait accompli, where whether or not anyone thought about it, it was something that was a fact and it was going to happen and become the law in Oregon. We also went through our kind of process of trying to figure out which way was up during COVID and whether in 2021 a live event was possible. We very much wanted to do so. But of course, we had to balance this with a practical attitude towards public safety and not only what was legally allowable, because for that period of 2 years, you simply couldn't do a live event should you want to, but also what would be responsible and appropriate. And while we were figuring this out and trying to find the model that would support Horizons going forward, in the years coming out of COVID, which were just tremendously difficult for everyone working in and around in events. And of course, that's, not to minimize the much greater suffering that many people had with loss of their health or loss of family members entirely. The weight of the system that was being set up in Portland and the relationship we were able to develop there with the local community, it simply felt like the right fit. And although there are, of course, much larger markets, we could have gone to LA or to the Bay Area, the place where it felt most relevant and the place where some of the partnership felt most natural really was in Oregon. And we don't really have such a growth mentality at Horizons. It's not really designed to be a business that has to grow larger and larger. And then we have to do Horizons Tokyo, and we have to see how many Horizons we can produce, how quickly. We're under really no pressure to scale in that manner. And so it allows us to be a little more kind of artistic and a little more community oriented in deciding how to grow the organization. And that was also just a big lesson coming out of the 2 years of chaos of COVID, and that there were many different plans we had and walked through and announced and had to walk back. It was very, very, very humbling, and a lot of lessons were learned about that. And one of them was that many people are going to be doing many things at this field. There's going to be a lot of events. A lot of them are going to be successful. They're going to serve different sectors of the community in very different ways. And that we're really looking to proceed with our values and our integrity and our model. And Portland is where we found, the best fit in terms of where does it feel good to do this, who are the partners we want to work with, and where can we be the most of service to this field.
Yeah, thanks for going into that background. And it's interesting that the 2-year kind of hiatus or the impact of COVID, for a lot of people we've been finding it's really brought a lot of soul searching and kind of reflecting, revisioning. What is my role? Like, who are we? What makes us unique? And so part of what you're saying, Kevin, is that Yeah, Horizons was really clarifying in this kind of increasingly busy space what makes us who we are. And you're really saying kind of integrity and having the right partners to really build something of value. And that's why, yeah, Portland and what's going on in Oregon with Measure 109, 110 makes just perfect sense.
And I emphasize that, as I said before, Horizons Year One, there was no 5-year plan. There was no intention to start a media business. The goal was simply to do something that would be in service of the field of psychedelics and really deliver knowledge and discussion of scholarly quality to a wider audience and to allow people to connect with one another. And that I've never seen it as being, well, Horizons has to be the largest. It has to be, in the Las Vegas Convention Center. That I've never seen it that Horizons has to go and see the things that other people are doing, and then we have to be competitive in that way. And again, for most of its lifetime, Horizons has really had been more of an art project than anything else, really an active service. And it's only that the field has accelerated so much, and the effort and format that is now required to do justice to this topic has become so much larger, and the responsibility has become so much heavier. And obviously, as the event has grown, there's a financial development to being able to meet those responsibilities. That is really why we've expanded. It's not been because, we saw an opportunity to have, a media company based around psychedelics.
Mm. And can we talk really specifically about Horizons Northwest and the feel that people will get when they're there? We've spoken about like the aesthetics in the building, but more about the people that are going to be presenting, the kind of spaces that are going to be curated, the subjects that are going to be spoken of, and I guess the values, the ethics, the integrity that's going to be threaded throughout the course of the program. Could you do a little paint a picture again of what people should expect to feel when they come?
Yeah, the goal of the project is really to be in service of the success of the Psilocybin Services Act system. And by that, I really mean increasing benefit to the public and limiting risk and harm, and helping the community there have the knowledge they need and the relationships they need and sort of the lenses they need to work together in the first few years to do something historic, which it is my hope is going to be of benefit to a lot of people, and to which the risks of which are going to be responsibly managed. And the program is designed in a way to speak to different audiences and different topics in order to help them understand what may be useful to them. And that ranges from classes that are specifically for people who want to become practitioners and are looking for a lot of information, both about that process, but about the sort of art, science, and craft of that. There is a day that is really focused on organization building and entrepreneurship, and taking one of the roles that is delegated to the private sector by the bill, and people who want to start a service center, a training academy, or a manufacturer, and how they'll be able to do that, and what are the different ways they can sort of build organizations that serve under the Psilocybin Services Act. There is a day that is primarily focused on science and just gaining knowledge about where the state of the art is from the scientific lens, primarily about healing and medicine, but also including mycology in general, and also benefits for well people who want to use psychedelics for personal growth or spiritual exploration in that model. The day on Saturday is called Psilocybin in Oregon, and it is very much focused on educating the general public who are interested in this about what measures 109 and 110 do and do not do, as there's still a lot of confusion about that. And then what it's really going to take for that community to meet the needs of that system and model and turn it into a success. And Sunday Psychedelics in the World is really about looking beyond the clinical model, looking beyond sort of the transactional model of the use of psychedelics in service centers, and seeing how these things are used in the world by traditional and indigenous communities, how they're used in the wild already in North America, and looking at kind of the big picture of what the meanings of those things are. So it's similar in that way to the way that we program the New York event, but it's much more focused on psilocybin, which is most relevant to Oregon. And also it's very focused on the structure of the Psilocybin Services Act and its implementation. Is it's a quite bespoke and unique thing. And we're really trying to create connection, understanding, dialogue in that specific community that will help more people get involved and responsibly manage the next couple of years.
I love how you just explained that. I really do, because just as 15 years ago, what you were building in New York didn't exist yet, and you sensed something was missing, and it evolved. So too in Oregon right now, it's on the verge of something absolutely monumental. I think it has global significance. So I love it in a sense. Horizons Northwest has that aspect of almost like a hands-on workshop, really getting into the weeds of this is what is happening. And for folks that are mission aligned, that this really, like, you want to be part of this and do it in a good way, a way that, like, we all know is going to help the maximum number of people to access this and have the least kind of capitalist, extractive, monopolizing effect for those folks who want to kind of share this wisdom and this opportunity. Let's actually work together to figure out, like, the nuts and bolts, the skills and the granular details, which are very complicated, and they haven't been completely finalized yet. But it's complicated. Like, I've been spending a bit of time looking at, how to get licensed as a service center, as a training provider, as a grower of mushrooms, and there's a lot of rules, and it's complex. So similar to, if you want to open a cannabis dispensary or a grow here in New York or New Jersey, which has just becoming legal, it's really complicated, and a lot of big companies are just moving in from California to Jersey or New York, and so I love that you're doing this. I assume to really help local people own what's growing organically here.
Well, I'll respond to that in a couple ways. And I just want to maybe back up, and what I should have said before also is that this event has really been programmed and designed hand in hand with, in particular, the Sri Eckert Foundation and Tom Eckert, who, with his late wife Sri, were the originators of the 109 system, and many, many other advisors who are in Oregon in particular. And that, I certainly want to be in service of the local community there, and have really been relying on the local guidance and expertise of the people who are living with this day in, day out, in many cases have been for many years, and certainly will be for many years hence to come. So I don't mean to imply that the creation of this thing is, purely from within the Horizons organization, and that Sri Eckert Foundation has been a very important and vital partner for us. And quite honestly, without a strong local partner, we just wouldn't have done this. I don't think we would have just shown up at another community without having spoken with a lot of stakeholders there, and without strong local acceptance and support. To address some of the things you brought up, there are some unique features of the 109 system that make it quite different than the nationwide system that is going to exist under the FDA model. And one of which is that it's very likely that the cost of the drug itself, the psilocybin products, is going to be very, very modest, approaching true commodity cost of what it actually simply is the expense of growing mushrooms of uniform quality, and having them analyzed for potency, or with similar sort of extract products. So one of the big prizes in the larger medicalized system is really IP ownerships of the drugs and the ability to sell and distribute drugs. And there are going to be manufacturing companies under the Oregon system, but they're likely to be pretty modest in scale. And everyone who simply wants to use mushroom material or a simple mushroom product will be able to do so at pretty reasonable cost with regard to the drug itself. The cost of psychedelics that are going to flow through the FDA pathway under the medical model are going to be quite significant, although again, only one portion of the cost of an entire course of treatment. So the larger sort of drug developer and pharmaceutical companies, not only can they not really participate in Oregon because it's in contravention to federal law, but also because there's not much there for them. It's really going to be something that people who produce mushrooms or mushroom products are going to be the ones who are doing that. Secondly, there are some limitations on ownership of the service centers themselves, and there's a limit to how many service centers a single partner may be a party to, and there's also a limitation on 24-month state of Oregon resident needing to be have controlling interest. And the intention of that is to make sure, at least for the first few years of the program, that things stay a little closer to the ground there, and that the control of the service centers is hoped to be for the benefit of Oregonians and to a group of people who see themselves accountable to the regional community, and not simply people who are attempting to create returns for investors who may not have a personal investment in the community within Oregon. Having said all of that, the Oregon system absolutely positively does support businesses and people having investors and forming businesses and making profits to own manufacturers, service centers, and training academies, and of course for individuals who want to become facilitators. And those are going to come in every kind of stripe and fashion, ranging from small community-oriented not-for-profit clinics to luxury resort centers charging large amounts of money to private individuals. So I don't think the Oregon system is anti-capitalist or anti-market. Again, the system deliberately delegates some of the most important pieces of this to the private sector. The point is that they really wanted to make sure that they are being conducted by people who have some attachment to the local community, and of course, underneath the regulation of the Oregon Health Authority, a municipal government.
Does the conference itself have people from, say, the Oregon Health Authority, and obviously, Tom Eckert's going to be there, but any other folks that were involved, in the early days or that are involved now in the actual kind of building of the regs, the rules and policies, and are those folks going to be part of it?
Yes, we do have people representing the Oregon Health Authority in an official capacity who will be speaking near daily. I can't, there's a number of other speakers I can't quite comment on yet, but there are going to be government officials there who are going to be speaking in that capacity, taking questions from other speakers, moderators in the audience, as well as, for instance, the attorneys who were involved in the drafting of the bill. And quite a few people taking the stage will be official advisory committee members or people who were advocates or activists with this going back years. But it was really important to us that the Oregon Health Authority be present at the event and that people feel like they're getting information that is of the official and best quality, and that we really see this as being working with the public, and that there's a unique thing in that, coming from New York, which is somewhat of a notoriously poorly governed state. Mm-hmm. If there were a program for psychedelics in New York State, as our path to even having the most rudimentary sort of cannabis system is shown, there's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles in New York. There's a lot of regulatory hurdles in New York. There is not necessarily a presumption of trust between the public in New York and some of the regulatory agencies, which is not to say that there aren't many fine both elected officials and civil servants doing great work here. But unfortunately, the state on the whole, its reputation is not as being one of the better governed and the better administered states in the union. What people have told me routinely throughout Oregon is that the Oregon Health Authority has a genuine desire to see this program succeed and to implement it faithfully, and that this is sort of a historic thing, that one of the first communities that is going to experience widespread regulated access to psychedelics also seems to have a regulatory partner that, again, may not have met everyone's desires, hopes, dreams, wishes in every way. And as the rules and orders are finalized, may continue to disappoint, some people. Generally seems to really want to conduct this in good faith and of high quality. And it's a remarkable thing. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to be a part of this event. And everyone I talked to throughout the psychedelic community in Oregon, everyone, of course, maybe being an exaggeration, but if I can restate that, there's a widespread feeling, within the community in Oregon that I've spoken to, that the OHA is really going to try to make this succeed and not mire it needlessly in bureaucratic hurdles or process.
That would be amazing. That would be quite unique. And yeah, this is unique already, what's happening there. So if that could be the case without the bureaucracy, fantastic. And of interest, I did go to a conference recently where there are a couple of people from the DEA. And at first, I found it really hard. There was a lot of counter-transference coming up for me. Yeah, and, just sitting around a table talking to them about what they're working on. And ultimately, I realized, and I was able to open up my mind to talk to them. They're doing some good work. Like they're trying to learn. Or at least the person that was there was kind of owning some of the mistakes that have been made in the past and how they're trying to, fast tracking just change. So I love that the OHA is kind of being part of this, and they're saying we want to make this work. What do you think about psilocybin mushrooms in particular? Why are they being, I suppose, highlighted or elevated above other mushrooms? Say particularly it's psilocybin cubensis. So why not other mushrooms, or why not other psychedelics? Do you have a sense of why that was put on the ballot measure, and perhaps any maybe more esoteric feelings or creative feelings around? What is it about the psilocybin containing mushrooms that is kind of this real pioneer for our movement going mainstream and accessible to anyone in Oregon?
Well, I back up, as I do want to visit the last thing you said a little bit, and that, let us not forget that Sasha and Ann Shulgin were actually married by a DEA official who asked as their wedding officiant. Governments are complex organizations with departments that have agencies that have sub-departments and are ultimately made up of humans. And there's a level of complexity there that belies, a stereotype that the government is against drugs or the government is about psychedelics. And what I think the success of many of the research and commercialization programs in the last few years has shown, particularly the MAPS, who started the work of trying to put together real clinical trials sooner than others did, is that the government is not a homogenous organization with a single opinion, and that there are often people and departments and administrators within government who hold their own opinions and beliefs, who are often quite reasonable or rational or open to change and progress, and that the presumption that everything that has to do with the government or law enforcement is bad and that they're against us and that they're enemies, that does not reflect the complex reality of the world. And Sasha Shulgin was lifelong friends with many people from the DEA because he was a chemist, and there were many people at the DEA who were also talented chemists, and they just loved to talk chemistry. And there's a great and many people in all kinds of jobs who do not necessarily share the beliefs of their employer, particularly if their employer happens to be the government. And there are many people within the government who will tell you that they hold progressive beliefs, and that their sincere belief is that the best way to create change within government is to be on the inside and to participate, and not to be on the outside and announce that you are against the government. And of course, there is a place for external advocates and activists and agitators as well. But it's good to remember, within the fields of government, policy, regulation, law enforcement, there's a diversity of beliefs. It's not, a single cartoon of Richard Nixon and that's the government.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. Good to know about the Shulgins as well. I had no idea they were married by a DEA person.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are good folks out there, definitely.
Could you lead me to your following question again?
Yeah,
it was about the provenance of mushrooms specifically.
The provenance, yes.
There's a specific. There is a few things why, and Tom is really the best person to speak with to this, although he's not here today. I will tell you from my perspective what I see and why mushrooms have kind of leapfrogged and become kind of the pop culture breakthrough, and have also been seen as being viable to legislators and regulators and the public in a way that, for instance, LSD is not. Part of it is that there has been a large amount of research that has been based around pure psilocybin, conducted at places like Johns Hopkins, NYU, and other institutions, that's been hitting the front page of the newspapers and 60 Minutes for quite some time now. And large members of the public have become accustomed to seeing that there is this thing called psilocybin, and that it may help people with substance abuse disorders and addiction, with depression and terminal anxiety, and that after 10 years of these kinds of headlines related to psilocybin, people all of a sudden have become open to the belief that it is, in fact, whatever this thing is that it holds promise and is beneficial. And I will tell you a story that reflects this a little bit, in that a few months ago I had to go to my local bank branch to take care of just some administrative thing for Horizons. And the person sitting across from me at the desk was a young retail banker wearing a cheap, poorly fitted suit, and who wanted to know, this Horizons, what do you guys do? And I said, we do a thing with conferences. What's your conference about? And it was the topic of the conference is psychedelics. And he goes, I've heard of these things. I've read that they help people with depression and they're being studied for medicine. That was pretty much the only thing this person who worked at a bank branch in Manhattan knew about psychedelics. Other drugs such as LSD, ayahuasca, have not been treated this well in the press. They've not been given as much coverage, and it hasn't been as easy for the general public to understand. The message that has been best for the public is there's this thing called psilocybin. It can be a part of the medical system. It's delivering medicine to people with depression, terminal anxiety disorder, addiction, people who are in the armed forces, who are struggling. And that message with that particular drug has been very successful and very easy for people to understand. We're also living through somewhat of a widespread cultural vogue for all things that are natural and plant-based. And whether it's an interior design trend that's about plants, or whether it's about culinary mushrooms, whether it is about a move to natural clothing and textiles and foods and so on and so forth, the story of the mushrooms that contain this thing, psilocybin, that has been, the subject of a decade of very good media coverage, has created really a pathway there for people to become comfortable in a way that things that are being seen as being purely synthetic, or something that simply seems obscure, or something that may be overly tied up in non-medical usage, have really struggled in the broad-based public mind, and in particularly when things get to legislators and regulators. And of course, measures 109 and 110 were direct ballot initiatives. They did not go through the legislative process. They were voted into existence by simply the people of Oregon. Those are the factors where I believe it was selected. And that's why I think it is easier to talk about publicly than, for instance, you would find with LSD, which people still have associations with left over from the media coverage from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, or to, for instance, ayahuasca, which people have a harder time understanding is having maybe a medical or therapeutic benefit, and still seems to be from outside the confines of traditional American medical or consumer culture.
Yeah, I've also noticed that the simple, humble mushrooms has an aspect of kind of innocence about it as well. And yeah, that we have a relationship with it already, just from a culinary perspective.
My personal view is that is a poetic belief, and it's a very beautiful poetic belief. But for instance, the bill headed to the floor in Colorado, the Natural Medicines Act, you can see how these things are being structured in a way to make them palatable to a much larger audience of the public voters and legislators who may not have a lot of detailed knowledge and may not take the time to do so about the topic of psychedelics, and need things presented to them in a very simple, understandable way. And this idea of mushrooms being a natural medicine has been very helpful in that regard.
Yeah, I remember seeing a while back, maybe last year, the framing of the referendum question to Oregonians was key. Obviously, the words and kind of language of the question's key, but also the amount of education that responders had prior to answering the question of, do you think that psilocybin should be legalized as a medicine, whatever the question was. They did a kind of an A/B test, and they, the question that was asked after delivering education to the average Oregonian about, the research around psilocybin-containing mushrooms for mental health and kind of the safety profile, and they're not addictive, they don't make people go crazy, and there's a lot of clinical trial work, and they're being fast-tracked by the FDA. So after they provided all of that education, there was a huge difference in people just supporting and saying yes to that. And they didn't initially have all of that information. There's still a good response rate, but maybe not quite enough to get it to the finish line. So a lot of that was education. I think interesting what you're saying there around Colorado, just framing them as natural medicines as well is a good linguistic move.
Right. And there's the way these things are set up are quite different in states that don't have a ballot initiative process, and where this kind of system will necessarily have to flow through a legislative process with elected representatives.
All right, so Kevin, we're at the top of the hour. What haven't we talked about? What else would you like to cover so that people can hear about it?
One thing that I want to emphasize is that the Oregon system is unique in that it is not really a medical system per se. And it's possible to practice medicine within it. You could be a therapist and take someone through one of the established research protocols, and under the Oregon system, provide what is medical care by a licensed clinician. But it also allows any member of the public who would like to do so to become a facilitator and to see people who would simply like a supervised psilocybin experience. And there is somewhat of a libertarian lens to this, where the idea being that if there's an activity that many people would like to do and that they believe they would find to be beneficial, and there's good reason to think that it could be, and that even if that activity has risks, instead of the government having a prohibitionist viewpoint and forbidding things that have risks from happening, the government should try to find some system to regulate that activity that helps manage those risks, but simply allows people the freedom to choose what they would like to do, presuming they're informed and able to make an adult decision on this. And I don't think this is very well understood. as it's quite different than what is being pursued by the organizations who intend to offer psychedelics as medication and medical treatments through the FDA pathway. And it's going to be very important for people in Oregon to understand that they're making an informed decision to take a risk with the facilitator, and that some of those facilitators are going to be licensed clinicians, other ones will not, and that this model inherently puts a lot more responsibility on the client in a way that is not really practiced in medicine. In medicine, the weight of responsibility really belongs on the clinician and the practitioner. Under the Oregon model, the weight is really evenly distributed between the facilitator, who will decide whether or not they want to sit with someone, and the client to decide whether they want to do this and what facilitator they want. And I think everyone needs to pretty candidly face the fact that there's risks in the system, and that some number of people, some percentage of people, we don't know what that percentage is yet, there's not great data on it, who have these really powerful psychedelic experiences are not going to be helped by it. And some percentage of people are in fact going to be harmed. And that will both happen as a result of people who are seeing facilitators who are not suited to them and not receiving the level of care that they need, particularly if they're already in distress. And that's also going to happen even in cases where people are receiving excellent care and people who are not in deep distress. These are really powerful experiences, and they come with risks. And the framework of the Oregon model is a very American West sort of way of looking at this. And the goal is to allow people to make a decision about whether or not they want to do something that may have benefit and may have risk. And in that regard, it's kind of similar to a decision about whether you want to go downhill skiing, or depending on your dosage level, whether you want to go on a helicopter drop in the middle of a mountain and go downhill skiing where there's no track. You know, Dr. David Nutt famously compared using ecstasy, I believe, to, statistically speaking, being about as dangerous as horseback riding. You know, most people don't live in fear of their children growing up to become equestrians, but everyone who is in the equestrian community will also tell you that they know people who have been injured, often very badly, by their decision to repeatedly engage in horseback riding. And I think it's an important thing to understand about the Oregon model, which is quite different than the medical model, which again can be practiced within the Oregon model, but many people will not be receiving medical care. They're going to be receiving facilitation.
Beautiful. I really love what you shared there. Thanks, Kevin. And yeah, I was thinking about that David Nutt comparison of horseback riding, and there's risk in so many areas of our life that we often don't properly, empirically evaluate and quantify. So it is very empowering to have what Oregon's doing around being able to access psilocybin, a lot more readily than anywhere else in the world. It's huge. Thank you. Anything else before we wrap up, Kevin?
Well, I want to, return to the topic of these events, in general, as I've, now been attending psychedelic community events, for since well before Horizons, of course, for basically my entire adult life. And I really believe, and my experience of the last 2.5 years and virtual events has made me believe so only more strongly, that these in-person events are essential to community building, and that they really do change people's lives. And that feel of being in a room surrounded by people who hold many of the interests and passions and values that you do, and existing in three-dimensional space, and going and listening and seeing people on stage, and not just clicking through articles, reading half of it, skipping another paragraph, deciding you're bored, or perhaps sitting around with, although I am also an admirer of the podcast medium, for me, to see the people who are doing this work and have committed their lives to it on stage, to meet sort of your fellow travelers in the audience, to be able to socialize and enjoy with them after the program is done. For people who are interested in this, for people who are kind of curious about it, for people who are maybe considering, do I want to spend my life working in this field? What kind of people go to this? Will I be welcome at this? Having these events really changes people's lives and empowers people to become community participants and leaders in a way that journal articles, magazines, and press coverage, videos, podcasts, packaged online learning, they really don't fulfill the same inspirational purpose. The event experience can really drive inspiration and optimism and connection in a way that I don't think other things do. Most of the knowledge that we put on stage is, quite frankly, already published in print somewhere, whether it's in a journal or in an interview or another video you could already watch. But the reasons people come to these things is that ultimately humans are humans and they need to do things with other humans, and that the two-dimensional, or I guess in the case of a podcast, you might describe it as one-dimensional. Depends whether we want to include time, I guess. It's not the same thing as being around people, spending time with people, getting to know with people. Yeah. And I'm very, very excited that the public health situation is in a place where, of course, COVID and sickness remains a risk, but it is now a widely understood and manageable risk, and that we can do these things again. Because while I know that a lot of people got useful information and a lot of people got good entertainment from virtual events and virtual learning, as people, including myself, continue from conventional, print, digital, and audio and film media, I really think if people are truly interested in this topic, in this field, they need to go and meet other people. And these kinds of events are where you can do that. And I have heard this again and again from people who were not sure whether they really wanted to risk their career by becoming publicly associated with psychedelics. And then they went to Horizons or another similar conference, and they could suddenly feel kind of the strength and the confidence to do so. I've heard so from many different kind of community activists who became inspired to create a community project, an activism project, a media project, once they went to one of these events and they saw and felt what the room was like. I've heard this from funders about people who either wanted to become a philanthropic funder or donor to psychedelic research or activism, or people who were in the world of kind of investment and finance and didn't know whether they could take seriously the kind of prospects that were being in front of them to invest in opportunities with psychedelics. And all of those were people who had read journal articles, magazine articles, watched videos galore. It is doing the fundamental human thing and being in a place with other human beings. That's what really created change in people's lives. And it was important that those things happened publicly and not at some private event with only a handful of people who are allowed to be there.
It's a really nice way of conceptualizing, in a sense, one of the roles of Horizons, of these kinds of in-person events. And you've both got kind of the groupies that have been to every event and they go every year. It's on their kind of calendar. And as well as just people that have never been before, like you're saying, like there's so many people that are asking questions and coming to conference, to events, to, societies. And it's that in-person piece, that energy that's there, that just knowing that this is real. It's actually happening and it's okay. And I believe in this. It's kind of more emotional. Like for me, it was like, for me, just leaving my career as a clinician, I just realized I just simply had to do it, and to leave like traditional Western addiction treatment to move into the psychedelic world to do what I'm doing. I think just feeling it emotionally. Yeah, no, just the emotional piece. This is emotional because we're talking about something that's been prohibited and criminalized for decades without very much, if any, kind of reason. And it's had a huge human impact. And right now it's absolutely essential that we kind of just recalibrate our relationship with psychedelics whilst also considering, the risk profiles. So these events are huge for turning the dial and reassuring people and giving a new sense of actually what the future could look like with these people that are kind of building the infrastructure. And
the tallest compliment I get is someone who has brought a family member or someone from their practice group or, maybe department, or even, from the business community who arrive in increasing numbers, someone from maybe their firm who has never used psychedelics before, to Horizons. That is the real victory for me. The people who are already enamored and interested in psychedelics, of course, I'm very, very grateful for their attendance and continued support. But when someone wants to bring someone to Horizons that is not already a part of this community and may harbor some skepticism, that's a real relationship of trust, especially when it's a family member and someone is kind of implicitly saying, I believe in this and the way you present it so well that I kind of trust my family relationships with this community and with this event and with what's being said on stage. That is the compliment I really, really am deeply honored and humbled to receive.
Yeah.
I also, I have a few more things I want to make sure we get through here.
You got it.
And one is that I'm aware that these events are now quite expensive for many people. And the reason that they cost so much is that they take a team of people an awful lot of time to produce. We do them in venues that are worthy of respect. We fly people in from across the country and across the world. We try to really bring a professional and dignified experience to these events. And at the same time, we recognize that not everyone has a high-income occupation and can afford to pay the standard rates. And we have a scholarship program for both Horizons Northwest and Horizons New York. The scholarship applications are open to everyone, not just people who are a student or engaged in practice or attempting to become a practitioner. Anyone who would like to take part in these gatherings that genuinely does not have the means to do so, we really invite everyone to fill out a scholarship application. It takes about half an hour. Every year, we award hundreds and hundreds of these out to the community. And I really do not want Horizons to be a luxury product in the sense that while we've raised the quality of the experience and increased the number of speakers and bring them in from increasingly, far-flung places, I don't want ordinary people or people who serve different kinds of communities or come from different kinds of communities to feel like they cannot attend to Horizons. It's very important to me that Horizons continues to be a place that people who have never gone to a conference before feel that they're welcome at Horizons. And it continues to be important to me that people who do not have high-income jobs and are community members or are deeply interested in this field can come to Horizons. And I wish we could do that in larger and larger numbers. And we are attempting to do so. But as of today, we have scholarship seats available for both Horizons New York and Horizons Northwest. So if you're interested in attending, but are put off by the standard pricing, please click the scholarship link and be in touch with us if you have any questions.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for mentioning that. Yeah, super important.
So I will mention a few other things. And people should really be aware that many of the newer events that are happening in this community are driven by the needs of psychedelic pharmaceutical startups to meet more and more investors and raise increasing amounts of capital from them. And that's, of course, a complicated topic, certainly worthy of its own discussion. I do not hold the belief that for-profit businesses or pharmaceutical companies are inherently bad or wrong and deserve castigation. I think it's a complex topic that requires a lot of attention and a lot of discussion, which is what we do hope to do on our stage. But in terms of the curatorship of many of these events, they are often not addressing vital themes that I think are going to be very important to the success of psychedelics integration into society. They often don't want to encounter difficult, unpleasant topics. They often don't want to look at things through a public health lens. They often don't want to encounter discussions about religious use or non-medical use. And it's really important that people understand when they see an event that's about psychedelics, whether they know whether or not it's being curated by a real editor, by a real curator, by a panel of experts who have been doing this work for many years, or whether it's being curated by PR agencies and investor relations representatives, or whether people are simply purchasing stage time, which is a model that many of these events are engaged in that we do not do at Horizons. And we do now have sponsors who support the event that we're very, very grateful for. But our event is still editorial and curatorially driven. And we have a wall between sponsorship sales and what goes on stage. And everyone in the community should be aware that many of the newer events are being programmed by people who are not experts in this field, who are very new to it, and who are simply trying to advance the prospects for PR departments and investor relations departments, and who are only really willing to address a small amount of the vast, complex, and wonderful topics that exist in the field of psychedelics.
Yeah, thanks for addressing that. And I've spoken about that quite a bit on the podcast, and it is tangible, the difference of experiencing conferences of the former and the latter, the extent to which the people on stage are kind of paying to be there. Yeah, thank you for that. We still got time. I'm still on record. What else you got?
Well, you do a lot of these interviews. What else do you think it's good to know about me or about Horizons or about what's going on in the world?
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd love to hear about is we're talking about the expansion into Oregon. Do you have a sense of where might be next? You mentioned Colorado already. Lots happening in California. But yes, there are other conferences already springing up in America. And are there any other places around the world where you think, even if it's not Horizons doing it, that you think would really benefit from that kind of approach, where having a place for people to meet experts and to have this subject matter kind of discussed, to bring those people into these kind of dialogues? Where do you feel like that needs to happen? And again, it doesn't need to be you doing it, but is there somewhere where this needs to happen in the way perhaps that isn't so much investor PR focused, that just needs to be like more science and policy and community and culture focused?
Well, to answer in a non-geographic way, there are a lot of communities, including in New York and in Oregon, that I believe really deserve a better welcome and more outreach and greater accessibility. And part of that may be for them to have their own community events. Just looking in the audience, you can tell that the makeup of the audience of the Horizons event does not reflect the general ethnic, racial, national origin makeup of the city of New York. And that is something that's very much on my mind. So, instead of answering the question in terms of what city or what region do I want to do a Horizons next, one of the things I just want to put out there is that there are a lot of communities for many reasons that have interest in this field, and I think deserve a chance to decide whether or not they're more interested in it and want to see about it, that cannot do so because their community does not have a lot of people who have time to volunteer and create a new project on their hands. They don't have the same access to money. They have communities that have been stigmatized, and anything relating to the use of drugs is treated quite differently internally and externally than it is kind of out there in the larger white American world. So I bring that up as a point because, again, I would love to do a better job serving many of those communities. And hopefully, as I hope that Horizons organization and my life stabilizes coming out of what I hope are the end of the core years of COVID, it's something we do want to put energy and effort to. So as long as we're, welcomed by those communities who are interested in that. But that is, I think, really the number one place for outreach. It's not really a geography. It's more of a demographic or a psychographic. Because in California, in New York, in the United Kingdom, and in Europe, you see who is participating in the psychedelic community, and in particular in the psychedelic industry, and it does not match the general makeup of those geographic communities as it is. And it is my belief that all of those individuals and the communities they're a part of should have a chance to do so if they're interested in it. And not enough work is being done. And this is an example of a model where it really does take community-focused organizations to do this work and produce these events. And it's something that simply the market left to its own devices is not going to address this. It takes work, it takes action, it takes community. So to answer the question you kind of asked, where else to go? The natural places to go are, I think, going to be places that are like Oregon, looking at defining some structure by which in the coming years, greater numbers of people will be able to access psychedelics. There's also places that within the US, for instance, may have a disproportionate impact on, the way the healthcare and medicine endeavors are rolled out, and whether that means the psychedelic community spending more time in DC, or the psychedelic community showing up and being present and participating in the larger medical and healthcare business events and communities. Those are things to look at. There's also often specific communities that have their own gatherings that might be more interested in these things, where we could do something to help support that. But again, my goal has been to grow at the speed in which we can do these projects well with integrity and serve communities. And we are quite happy for this year having a new conference in Oregon and our kind of flagship conference continuing in New York.
Beautiful. Thank you. So I'm seeing the time as well. So we did say we'd wrap by 5. So we'd better call it a day. But I did want to tell everyone, and you, Kevin, if you hadn't heard, a friend of ours, Aize Jama Everett, is a part of a group of people that are producing a documentary as well as a conference, particularly for Black people, Black professionals, kind of working in psychedelics, sacred medicine. And it's called A Table of Our Own. And that's the name of their website as well. So atableofourown.org. So that's a great example there. And I just loved as well. And a second thought I had, in a sense, the conferences tend to go to the most progressive places in the world, Colorado and Portland and New York. But there's a lot of places where the conversation and education and touch points of contact needs to be, maybe in the least progressive places or the most rural or the kind of the places where there's least access to services and the most need for these kind of dialogues. So a lot of great projects that could be, pollinated from conversations that start elsewhere and be brought back. And I've heard quite a few people that are inspired to take events or groups, keeping it small scale to start with, back to their communities, which are in, kind of deserts, literal or metaphorical deserts.
Yeah, and I was aware of A Table of Our Own, which sounds like a wonderful project. And one of the organizers, Kufakiri Amara, was one of kind of the features of a film we did during COVID-19, Black Lives in Psychedelics, where he is really one of the activists that played a large role in that film. And I'm really supportive of those kind of endeavors. And I do hope that the larger psychedelic community, in particular the community of funders, will stand up and show up and give generously to those kinds of endeavors. As again, many of them are in communities where there's just not as much volunteer time available. There's not as much extra money around, and that they're deserving and support of the resources that exist in the community I was in, which quite honestly, by being, a white man in New York City, I was able to do things like have time to start volunteer projects, or I could go to various kinds of venues and things like that. And no one would question me because of my appearance. Myself and Horizons have certainly benefited from the kinds of privileges I have as a white male in a place like New York. And I really do think to build, first of all and foremost, just to do justice to what the world ought to be like and who ought to be able to engage with the field of psychedelics, but also to, fulfill the promises and discussions that are being discussed in terms of we're trying to improve the state of mental health. We're trying to improve medicine. That can't just be for some small group of people with the greatest entitlement and the greatest privilege. So in particular, for all of the funders and all of the businesses who have in their publicity materials about how their goal is to revolutionize mental health, or their goal is to improve access to revolutionary healthcare treatments, I encourage them to really consider diversity, equity, and inclusion as a part of that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Lovely place to leave our conversation, Kevin. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and thank you for everything you've done with Horizons, and enjoy Horizons Northwest in September.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me.
God bless. Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Be well.
There you go. Hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you are able to make it to Oregon. It really sounds like a cool conference. And those dates again, Thursday, September 15th through Sunday, September the 18th. And to get 17% off, use this code, Psychedelics Today -NW-17. And if you haven't liked or subscribed to this podcast or given it a review, please do so. It really helps us to be found by other people. And like us on social media, we're everywhere. And also, if you haven't signed up for our bi-weekly newsletter, Keeping Tabs, go and do so. Check it out on the main website, psychedelicstoday.com, where you can also check out other blogs and podcasts. And our trainings are on psychedeliceducationcenter.com, with our new cohort of Navigating Psychedelics coming up on Wednesday, September 14th. And have a lovely weekend, whatever you're up to, wherever you are in the world. Just be happy and stay well. God bless everyone.